The house on Maple Street had stood for 43 years, and Eleanor March's hands had painted every inch of it twice. She remembered the first coat of pale butter yellow that her husband Arthur had called optimistic, and the neighbors had called brave. She had been 26 then, with a baby on her hip and a paintbrush in her hand, and she had believed that a house could be made into a home if you loved it hard enough. She had painted the trim white, planted roses along the fence, and replaced the kitchen cabinets with her own hands when the hinges rusted through. Love, she was learning, did not pay property taxes. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocery store circular and a bill from the electric company. Eleanor had opened it standing at the kitchen counter, the same counter where she had rolled out cookie dough for 3 children, where she had helped with homework, where she had held Arthur's hand through the last 6 months of his life. The letter was from her son Michael. "Dear Mom, we need to talk about the house. The market is good right now. We think it's time." Eleanor had read the sentence 3 times, waiting for it to mean something else. Words did not change their meaning no matter how many times you read them. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where she kept Arthur's old reading glasses and the stub from their 40th anniversary dinner. Then she walked to the living room window and looked out at the street she had watched change for 4 decades. The Johnson twins had moved away in 1998. The old oak tree at the corner had been struck by lightning in 2003. The children who used to ride their bikes past her house were now grown, driving cars, paying mortgages of their own. Eleanor understood that time moved forward and did not ask permission. Understanding something and accepting it were 2 different doors, and she was standing in the hallway between them. The meeting happened on a Sunday. Eleanor's 3 children arrived in separate cars, as if they needed to make a statement about their independence. Michael came first, driving a silver sedan that still smelled like the dealership. He worked in corporate finance and wore suits that cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. Susan arrived next, her minivan filled with the sound of children arguing in the back seat. She taught 6th grade English and carried the exhausted look of someone who had been giving for 30 years and had nothing left for herself. David came last, apologizing for being late, his hands stained with ink from the comic book store he managed. Eleanor made coffee and set out the good china, because that was what you did when your children came home. She noticed that none of them sat in their usual places at the table. Michael took the head seat, Arthur's seat, and Susan sat across from him, her arms crossed. David hovered near the doorway, as if he might need to leave quickly. "Mom," Michael began, and his voice had the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in the car. "The house needs too much work. The roof is 20 years old. The foundation has cracks. You can't maintain it alone." Eleanor looked at the cracks in the ceiling that she had learned to ignore, the water stain in the corner that Arthur had always meant to fix. She said nothing. "We've found a place," Susan added, and her tone was gentler but no less certain. "A nice assisted living facility. You'll have your own room. Meals are included. There are activities." Eleanor had seen the brochures. Susan had left one on the coffee table 3 weeks ago, as if she were leaving a seed that might grow into acceptance. The facility was called Sunrise Gardens, and the brochure showed photographs of smiling elderly people playing bingo and sitting in carefully arranged chairs around a television. Eleanor understood that her children had been planning this for months. What she did not understand was why they had not told her. "We can get $700,000 for the house in this market," Michael said, and he wrote the number on a napkin as if it were the answer to a math problem. "Split 3 ways, that's over $200,000 each. Susan needs it for the kids' college. David could use it to finally get his life together, and you'll be taken care of at Sunrise. It's the smart move." Eleanor looked at her hands, which had held each of these children when they were small and helpless and entirely dependent on her love. She could not find the words to explain that a house was not a math problem. David spoke for the first time. "Mom, I don't want to do this, but I can't afford to say no." Eleanor understood that her children had already voted, and the vote was 3-0. She had raised them to be independent thinkers, and now their independence had turned against her. "I'll need time," she said, and her voice sounded small and far away, like someone else speaking through a long tunnel. "Time to pack. Time to say goodbye." Michael checked his watch. "We can give you 2 weeks. The realtor wants to list it by the 1st of the month." Eleanor nodded, because nodding was easier than fighting. She felt something break inside her chest, a crack that matched the ones in the ceiling, a fissure that would never be repaired. The packing began the next morning. Eleanor started with Arthur's closet, because that was the hardest room in the house and she wanted to get it over with. His suits hung in dry cleaner bags, preserved like museum pieces. His shoes sat in a row, polished and ready for a life he would never return to. She took each garment down, folded it, and placed it in a donation box. She kept his blue sweater, the one with the hole in the elbow, because it still smelled like him. The house had accumulated 43 years of objects, and each object carried a memory like a ghost. The cookie jar shaped like a rooster that the children had given her for Mother's Day in 1986, the cast iron skillet that had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. The framed photograph of Arthur holding a fish on a beach in Maine, his face sunburned and happy. Eleanor packed slowly, carefully, as if each item were a letter she was writing to herself. She knew that no matter how carefully she packed, she would forget something important. On the third day, Susan came to help. She brought boxes from the liquor store, flattened and taped, and a roll of bubble wrap that she had bought at the post office. "You don't need to take all of this," Susan said, picking up a ceramic figurine of a ballerina that had been Eleanor's for as long as anyone could remember. "Sunrise has limited space. You get one dresser and one closet." Eleanor looked at the ballerina, which had been a gift from her mother on her wedding day, and tried to imagine it in a room she had never seen. She could not picture it. "I'll help you sort," Susan said, and her voice was kind, but her hands were already making piles. Keep, donate, throw away. Eleanor watched as her life was reduced to categories. She noticed that Susan put the ballerina in the donut pile. The day the for sale sign went up, Eleanor sat on the porch and watched the realtor hammer it into the lawn. The sign was red and white and said SOL'd in capital letters, with a blank space for the price. The realtor, a woman named Patricia with a smile that looked practiced, had explained that the sign would attract attention. "We'll have offers within a week," she said. "This market is hot." Eleanor looked at the roses she had planted along the fence, which were just beginning to bloom. She wondered if the new owners would water them. The neighbors came out to say goodbye. Mrs. Kowalski from next door brought a casserole and a bottle of wine. Mr. Henderson from across the street shook Eleanor's hand and told her she had been a good neighbor for 43 years. The young couple who had just moved in 3 doors down waved from their driveway, and Eleanor realized they had never learned each other's names. Eleanor accepted the casserole and the wine and the handshakes, because that was what you did at the end of something. She felt like a ghost already, haunting a house that no longer belonged to her. The eviction notice arrived on a Friday. It was not really an eviction, Michael explained over the phone. It was a notice to vacate, which was a legal document that said she had to be out by the end of the month. The buyers wanted a quick close, and the paperwork had to be filed. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, holding the phone, and listened to her son explain the mechanics of her displacement. She heard only the word eviction, which was the same word they used for people who had done something wrong. "I'm sorry, Mom," Michael said, and he sounded like he meant it, "but this is how it has to be." Eleanor hung up the phone and walked to the drawer where she kept Arthur's glasses. She did not open it. She just stood there, her hand on the handle, and waited for something to change. The night before she was supposed to leave, Eleanor sat alone in the dark living room. The furniture had been sold or donated or packed. The walls were bare except for the outlines where pictures had hung. The house smelled like dust and emptiness and the end of things. Eleanor sat in the last chair that remained, a worn recliner that had been Arthur's favorite, and watched the headlights of passing cars sweep across the ceiling. She could not bring herself to get up and go to bed. The doorbell rang at 11 o'clock. Eleanor did not move at first. She assumed it was a mistake, someone at the wrong house, a late-night delivery. But the doorbell rang again, and then someone knocked. She pushed herself up from the chair, her knees creaking, and walked to the front door. She did not turn on the porch light, because she was afraid of who might be standing there. She opened the door to find a woman she had not seen in 3 years. Her name was Clara. She had been married to David for 8 years before they divorced, and Eleanor had always thought of her as a daughter. The family had never approved they had called Clara the wrong choice, a woman with no money and no future and nothing to offer, but Eleanor had seen something in her that the others missed, a kindness, a patience, a strength that did not need to announce itself. Eleanor stared at Clara, who was standing on the porch in the rain, holding a duffel bag and a set of car keys. She could not find words. "I heard what they're doing," Clara said, and her voice was steady, without anger or pity. "David told me. He called me tonight crying. He said you have nowhere to go." Eleanor nodded, because it was true. She did not understand why Clara was here at 11 o'clock on a rainy night, holding a duffel bag. "I have a place," Clara said. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry and has a door that locks. And I have a plan. Eleanor looked at Clara's face, which was wet with rain and lit by the dim porch light. She saw something in Clara's eyes that she had not seen in anyone's eyes for a long time, certainty. "Get your coat," Clara said. "We're leaving tonight." The car was a 2004 Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a bumper held on by duct tape. Eleanor sat in the front seat with her purse in her lap and the small suitcase that contained the essentials: Arthur's sweater, the photograph from Maine, the ceramic ballerina, and a set of keys that no longer fit any lock. She watched the house on Maple Street disappear in the rearview mirror, the red Eswold sign growing smaller and smaller until it was just a speck of color in the darkness. She did not cry. She had used up all her tears in the weeks of packing. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, and her voice sounded hollow, like an echo in an empty room. "North," Clara said. "About 3 hours. There's a town called Millbrook. I bought a property there last year." Eleanor turned to look at Clara, who was driving with both hands on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She could not imagine what kind of property Clara could afford on her salary as a waitress. "It's a motel," Clara said, as if reading Eleanor's thoughts. "An old motel on a highway that doesn't get much traffic anymore. The previous owner was going to tear it down, but I bought it for back taxes." $6,000. Eleanor tried to picture a motel, and she saw peeling paint and broken windows and vacancy signs that had been dark for years. She said nothing, because she had learned that expectations were a luxury she could no longer afford. "I know what you're thinking," Clara said, "but hear me out. The motel has 12 rooms. The roof is sound, the plumbing works, and the property goes all the way back to a creek. There's a garden space. Or there could be, with work." Eleanor looked out the window at the dark highway, the headlights cutting through the rain. She felt a small flicker of something she had not felt in weeks: curiosity. Millbrook was not a town so much as a memory of one. The main street had a gas station, a diner, a hardware store, and a post office that closed at noon on Wednesdays. The houses were small and old and set back from the road, with porches that sagged and paint that peeled. The people, Clara said, were mostly elderly or gone, the young having moved to cities where jobs existed. They drove through the center of town at dawn, the sun just beginning to light the sky. Eleanor saw that the diner was already open, steam rising from a coffee urn visible through the window. She did not ask Clara to stop, because she was afraid that if she got out of the car, she would not be able to get back in. The motel was a quarter-mile past the town limits, on a stretch of highway that had been bypassed by the interstate 20 years ago. It was called the Pine Cone Motor Lodge, and the sign was faded and tilted, the letters barely legible. Clara pulled into the gravel parking lot, and Eleanor saw 12 doors in a single row, each painted a different color that had faded to the same shade of gray. She also saw that the windows were intact, the roof looked solid, and the gravel had been recently raked. "It's not the Ritz," Clara said, and she smiled for the first time since picking Eleanor up. "But it's ours." Eleanor got out of the car and stood in the parking lot, the morning air cold and clean, and looked at the motel that Clara had bought for $6,000. She saw something that Clara might have missed. Behind the motel, past the gravel lot, there was a stretch of land that sloped down to a creek, and the land was covered in wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, blooming in the early summer light. "What's back there?" Eleanor asked, pointing. Clara walked over to stand beside her. "That's the garden I told you about. It's been neglected for years. But the soil is good. I had it tested." Eleanor looked at the wildflowers, which were growing without anyone's permission or care, and she thought about resilience. She also thought about the house on Maple Street, which had been sold to strangers who would probably tear out her roses. "I used to have a garden," Eleanor said, "in the backyard. Vegetables, herbs. Arthur built me raised beds." Clara turned to look at her, and there was something in her eyes that looked like hope. She did not say anything, because some plans are too fragile to speak aloud. The first week was survival. Clara had been living in room number 7, the largest of the 12, which she had converted into a makeshift apartment. There was a bed, a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a plastic tub that served as a closet. Eleanor slept on a fold-out cot that Clara had bought from the hardware store, and in the morning, they shared instant coffee and oatmeal. Eleanor learned the rhythm of Clara's life. Wake at 6, check the rooms, sweep the parking lot, answer the phone that never rang, wait for guests who never came. She also learned that Clara had not bought the motel as a business. She had bought it as a refuge. "I needed somewhere to go," Clara said one morning, stirring her coffee with a plastic spoon. "After the divorce, I had nothing. David got the apartment, the car, the furniture. I got my clothes and my dignity, and that was barely enough." Eleanor listened, because she understood what it meant to lose everything. She also understood that Clara had not given up. I started working at the diner in town, Clara continued. Saved every penny. 2 years later, I had $6,000. Not enough for a house. Not enough for an apartment. But enough for a motel that nobody wanted. Eleanor looked around room number 7, which was small and shabby and smelled like dust and instant coffee. She also felt something she had not felt in her own house in years: safety. The second week, they started cleaning. The motel had 12 rooms, and each room had a story written in the layers of neglect. The carpets were stained. The walls were marked with the ghosts of old furniture. The bathrooms had mildew in the corners and rust on the faucets. Eleanor and Clara worked side by side, scrubbing floors and washing windows and throwing away the debris of decades. As they worked, Eleanor began to see the bones of the place. The floors were hardwood under the stained carpets. The walls were solid plaster, not drywall. The windows were old and drafty, but they had original glass that caught the light in a way that new windows never could. "This place has good bones," Eleanor said, and she heard Arthur's voice in her own words. He had said the same thing about the house on Maple Street 43 years ago. Clara stopped scrubbing and looked at her. "You think so?" "I know so," Eleanor said. "I've seen bad bones. This isn't bad bones." She did not say what she was thinking, that good bones were not enough, that a building needed more than structure. It needed purpose. The third week, the idea came to Eleanor in the middle of the night. She was lying on the fold-out cot, staring at the ceiling, and she was thinking about the wildflowers behind the motel, the purple and yellow and white, the way they grew without anyone's permission, the way they bloomed in a place that everyone had forgotten. She sat up in the darkness, the idea forming like a photograph developing in chemical baths. She was afraid to speak it aloud, because ideas that sound impossible in the dark often sound foolish in the daylight. In the morning, over instant coffee and oatmeal, Eleanor said, "What if we didn't try to rent the rooms?" Clara looked up from her bowl. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the rooms aren't the point?" Eleanor said, and she could feel the idea taking shape as she spoke. "What if the garden is the point?" Clara put down her spoon and listened. "The land behind the motel," Eleanor continued, "it's good soil, you said so yourself, and it gets sun all day, and there's a creek for water. What if we turned it into a real garden? Not just flowers, vegetables, herbs, things people can use." Clara looked skeptical. "Who would buy vegetables from a motel in the middle of nowhere?" "The diner," Eleanor said. "The hardware store, the people in town. There's no grocery store in Millbrook. The nearest one is 20 miles away. People have to drive for fresh produce." "What if we brought the produce to them?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor watched her face, looking for the rejection that she expected. Instead, Clara smiled. "I like that," she said. "I like that a lot." Eleanor felt something warm spread through her chest, something she had not felt since Arthur died. She also knew that a garden was not enough. A garden was a start, but it was not a plan. "There's something else," Eleanor said, and she took a deep breath. "The rooms. What if we didn't try to rent them as a motel? What if we turned them into something else?" Clara leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her eyes fixed on Eleanor's face. Eleanor hesitated, because the idea was still half-formed, like a sentence she had not finished writing. "What if we turned them into a home?" Eleanor said. "Not a motel. A home. For people who need one." Clara's expression changed, and Eleanor saw something shift behind her eyes, a door opening that had been locked for a long time. She also saw fear, and she understood that fear because she felt it too. "I don't have the money for that kind of renovation," Clara said. "I barely have the money for paint and brushes." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I have something better than money." Clara waited, and Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out the ceramic ballerina that she had saved from the donut pile. "This belonged to my mother," Eleanor said, "and her mother before that. It's not worth much on paper, but it's worth everything to me." Clara looked confused. "I don't understand." "The house on Maple Street is gone," Eleanor said, "but I still have the things that matter. I have Arthur's sweater. I have the photograph from Maine. I have this ballerina. And I have 43 years of knowing how to make a home." Clara reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor could feel the idea growing between them, taking root in the good soil of possibility. The first thing they did was plant the garden. Eleanor had not worked with soil in years, but her hands remembered what to do. She showed Clara how to turn the earth, how to test the pH, how to plant seeds at the right depth. They bought seeds from the hardware store: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, basil, rosemary, thyme, and they planted them in rows that followed the slope of the land down to the creek. The garden grew slowly at first, then faster, as if the earth was grateful for the attention. Eleanor knew that a garden was a promise, not a guarantee. A hailstorm could destroy it, a drought could kill it, a single late frost could undo months of work. "That's why we need a backup plan," Eleanor said one afternoon, wiping sweat from her forehead. "The garden is one thing, but we need something that can't be destroyed by weather." Clara looked up from the row of tomato plants she was watering. "What do you have in mind?" "The rooms," Eleanor said. "We start with one. We fix it up, make it beautiful, then we show people what's possible." Clara's face fell. "Eleanor, I told you, I don't have the money for that." "You don't need money," Eleanor said. "You need time and patience and a willingness to get your hands dirty, and you have all three." Clara looked at the row of empty rooms, their doors faded and their windows dusty, and Eleanor could see her calculating, measuring, wondering. She did not say no, and that was enough for now. Room number 1 became their project. They started with the carpet, which they pulled up in strips, revealing the hardwood floors underneath. The wood was stained and scratched, but it was solid, and Eleanor spent 3 days sanding it by hand, her knees aching, her back screaming, her hands blistered. Clara watched her work and learned, and then she took over when Eleanor's hands gave out. Neither of them complained, because they were building something together, and that gave the work meaning. The walls needed paint, and they found a can of sage green in the back of the hardware store, marked down because someone had returned it. Eleanor mixed it with white paint she found in the motel's storage shed, and the result was a soft, muted green that reminded her of the wildflowers behind the motel. They painted the walls, and the room began to look like a room, not a cell. Eleanor knew that paint was not enough. A home needed details, small things, personal things. She brought Arthur's sweater from her suitcase and hung it on a hook by the door. She placed the ceramic ballerina on the windowsill, where the morning light would catch it. She found an old photograph of Clara at the diner, laughing with a customer, and she framed it with a piece of cardboard and some tape. The room began to have a soul, and Eleanor could feel it waking up, like a patient coming out of a long coma. She also knew that one room was not enough. They needed 12, and they had no money and no time and no help. The break came from an unexpected direction. Eleanor had been going through the motel storage shed, looking for anything useful, when she found a box of old newspapers. The papers were from 1987, yellowed and brittle, and they were wrapped around a set of ceramic dishes that had been packed away and forgotten. Eleanor unwrapped the dishes carefully, and she saw that they were hand-painted, each one different, each one beautiful. She also saw that there were 12 of them, and she had an idea. "These are valuable," Eleanor said, showing Clara the dishes over dinner. Hand-painted. "Probably worth $100 each to the right collector." Clara looked at the dishes, and Eleanor could see her calculating again. "That's $1,200. "Enough to fix up 2 more rooms," Eleanor said. "Maybe 3, if we're careful." Clara shook her head. "We can't sell them. They're yours. They were in the motel when I bought it." "They were abandoned," Eleanor said. "Like this place. Like me. Like you. And now they have a purpose." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and then she nodded. Eleanor could see that Clara was still afraid, and she understood that fear, because she felt it too. They sold the dishes to a collector in the city, who paid $1,100 and promised to come back if they found more. They had money, and they spent it carefully. Paint, brushes, a new toilet for room number 2, a set of curtains from the thrift store, a bed frame from a garage sale. Eleanor knew that money ran out, and when it did, they would be back where they started. "We need a business," Eleanor said one night, lying on her cot, staring at the ceiling. "Something that brings in money regularly, not just one-time sales." Clara was quiet, and Eleanor could hear her thinking in the darkness. Neither of them had an answer. The answer came from the garden. The tomatoes were ripe, and the basil was fragrant, and the peppers were turning red on the vines. Eleanor had been harvesting every morning, and the yield was more than they could eat. She took a basket of vegetables to the diner in town, where the cook, a man named Frank, looked at them with surprise. "These are beautiful," Frank said, holding up a tomato that was still warm from the sun. "Where did you get them?" "I grew them," Eleanor said, "behind the Pinecone Motor Lodge." Frank looked at her with new respect, and he offered to buy the entire basket for $20. Eleanor did not take the money. Instead, she made a deal. "I'll give you the vegetables for free," she said, in exchange for something else. Frank waited, and Eleanor explained her plan. The deal was simple. Frank would let Eleanor and Clara use the diner's kitchen on Sunday mornings when the diner was closed. In exchange, they would give him first pick of the garden's harvest. Eleanor and Clara started making jam. They used the strawberries that grew along the creek, the rhubarb that had been planted by the previous owner, the mint that had spread like a weed. They boiled and stirred and canned, and by the end of the first Sunday, they had 30 jars of jam, each one labeled by hand. They sold the jam at the hardware store, which agreed to keep a case on the counter. The store owner, a woman named Betty, sold all 30 jars in 3 days. That was not enough to pay the bills. "We need volume," Eleanor said. "We need to make more. We need to sell more." Clara looked at the garden, which was producing faster than they could harvest, and she calculated how many jars they could make in a week. She also looked at the empty rooms, which still needed work, and she wondered if they were doing the right thing. The 5th room was the hardest. Eleanor had been working on it for 2 weeks, but the progress was slow. Her hands hurt, her back hurt, her knees hurt. She was 78 years old, and she was acting like she was 25. She sat down on the floor of room number 5, surrounded by paint cans and brushes and drop cloths, and she cried. She did not cry because of the pain. She cried because she was tired of fighting. Clara found her there, sitting on the floor, her face wet with tears, her hands stained with paint. Clara sat down beside her, and she did not say anything, because sometimes there are no words that help. After a long moment, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a key. "What's that?" Eleanor asked, wiping her eyes. "It's a key to the motel," Clara said. "I had it made for you. Because this is your home now. It's your home as much as it is mine." Eleanor took the key, which was small and silver and ordinary, and she held it in her palm. It felt like the most important thing she had ever held. The 6th month was the turning point. The garden had produced more than they could use, and the jam business had grown from a Sunday hobby to a regular operation. They were selling at the hardware store, the diner, and a farmer's market in the next town over. They had made enough money to fix up 6 of the 12 rooms, and 3 of those rooms were rented to people who needed a place to stay. Eleanor and Clara had become part of Millbrook, known as the 2 women who had the old motel back to life. The family on Maple Street had not forgotten about Eleanor. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor was in the garden harvesting tomatoes when Clara came out with the phone in her hand. "It's David," Clara said, and her voice was careful, measured. "He wants to talk to you." Eleanor took the phone, and she held it for a long moment before putting it to her ear. She did not know what to say to her son, who had voted to sell her house and put her in a home. "Mom?" David's voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Is that you?" "It's me," Eleanor said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. There was a long pause, and Eleanor could hear David breathing on the other end of the line. She did not fill the silence, because she had learned that silence was a gift that allowed people to speak their truth. "I'm sorry, David," David said, his voice cracked. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have stopped them. I should have fought harder. I should have—" "You did what you thought was right," Eleanor said, and she meant it. "We all do what we think is right. Sometimes we're wrong." David was quiet, and Eleanor could hear him crying, and she felt her own tears coming. She did not let them fall. "I want to see you," David said. "I want to see where you are. I want to meet Clara. I want to apologize to her too." Eleanor looked at Clara, who was standing in the garden, watching her, and she nodded. She did not know if she was ready to let her son back into her life. David came on a Saturday. He drove up in his old car, the one that had been in the shop more times than he could count, and he parked in the gravel lot next to Clara's Honda. He got out slowly, looking at the motel, at the garden, at the sign that said Pinecone Motor Lodge in faded letters. Eleanor watched him from the porch of room number 1, where she was sitting in a rocking chair that Clara had found at a yard sale. She did not get up to meet him. David walked across the parking lot, his steps uncertain, and when he reached the porch, he stopped and looked at his mother. "It's beautiful," he said, and he meant it. Eleanor looked at the motel, which was still shabby and faded and in need of work, but which had become something more than a building. She did not say anything, because she was waiting for him to say what he had come to say. "I brought something," David said, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I found it in the attic. After you left, I thought you might want it." Eleanor took the box, and she opened it, and inside was Arthur's wedding ring, the one he had worn for 47 years. The one that had been buried with him. David had kept it, and Eleanor did not understand. "I took it before the funeral," David said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know why. I just couldn't let it go. I thought maybe someday I would give it to my son, But I don't have a son. I don't have anyone. Except you. Eleanor held the ring in her palm and she felt Arthur's presence, as if he were standing beside her. She also felt the weight of David's confession, which was heavier than any ring. I'm sorry, David said again, and this time he was crying openly. I'm sorry for everything. For the house, for the eviction, for being a coward. Eleanor stood up and she walked to her son and she put her arms around him. She did not say that everything was forgiven because some things take time to heal. That night, Eleanor sat in the garden looking at the stars. The sky was clear and dark, and the stars were brighter than they had ever been on Maple Street, where the city lights had washed them out. She could see the Milky Way, a river of light stretching across the sky, and she thought about how small she was, and how large the universe was, and how strange it was that she was here in this place at this time. She heard footsteps behind her, and she knew it was Clara. Can I sit with you? Clara asked. Eleanor nodded, and Clara sat down beside her, and they looked at the stars together. Eleanor knew that Clara had something to say. I never told you why I really bought this place, Clara said, and her voice was quiet like. She was afraid of the words. I told you the practical reasons, but there's more. Eleanor turned to look at her daughter, whose face was half lit by the glow of the porch light, half shadowed by the night. Clara's hands were clasped in her lap, her fingers twisting together in a way that Eleanor recognized from 1,000 childhood moments of nervousness. I bought it because I was running away, Clara said. Not from anything bad, exactly, but from myself, from the person I was becoming. Eleanor waited, because she had learned that sometimes the best thing you could do was to let someone speak without interruption. Clara's silence stretched, and Eleanor could feel the weight of something unsaid pressing down on them both. I was engaged, Clara said finally. Before, to a man named Daniel. He was good, Mom. He was kind and stable, and he loved me, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't do what? Eleanor asked, though she already knew. I couldn't say yes. I stood at the altar, in a white dress that cost more than my first car, and I looked at his face, and I knew that if I said yes, I would be someone I didn't want to be. I would be his wife, and then his children's mother, and I would live in a house with a white picket fence, and I would die having never been anything else. Eleanor reached out and took Clara's hand, because she understood that fear better than Clara could know. Clara pulled her hand away, not in anger, but in a kind of desperate need to finish her story. I ran. I literally ran. Down the aisle, out the church doors in my wedding dress, with everyone watching. I got in my car and I drove for 3 days. I ended up here in this town, at this motel, and I saw the for sale sign and I thought, this is it. This is where I can disappear. This is where I can become no one. Eleanor looked at the garden, at the motel, at the stars, and she saw it all differently. Not as a refuge, but as a hiding place. She also saw that Clara had not disappeared. She had grown and changed and become something new. I'm not running anymore, Clara said, and her voice was stronger now. I think maybe that's why I called you. Because I knew that if you came here, I would have to stop. I would have to face the person I was and the person I wanted to be. Eleanor thought about her own life and the way she had run from the things that scared her. She had run from David's grief, from her own loneliness, from the empty house and the quiet rooms. She had run to this motel, to this garden, to these stars. She had also found something here. She had found Clara again. She had found a purpose. She had found, in the soil and the seeds and the slow, patient work of growing things, a kind of peace she had never known. I'm glad you called, Eleanor said, and she meant it. The next morning, David was sitting at the picnic table in the garden, drinking coffee from a chipped mug that said, War Eldest Best Daddy. Eleanor had found it at a thrift store, and she had bought it because it made her laugh, and because she had never bought a mug like that before. She sat down across from him, and they drank their coffee in silence, listening to the birds and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long conversation, when everything that needed to be said had been said, and the only thing left was to be together. I've been thinking about Dad, David said, and his voice was careful, like he was testing the ground. Eleanor nodded, because she had been thinking about Arthur too. I think I blamed him, David said, for dying, for leaving, for not being there when I needed him, and I blamed you too for not being able to fix it. Eleanor did not flinch, because she had blamed herself for those things too. I don't blame anyone anymore, David said. I'm just tired of being angry, tired of being alone. Tired of pretending that I'm fine when I'm not. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand on David's. and she felt the familiar shape of his fingers, the same fingers that had held hers when he was a child, crossing the street, learning to walk. She also felt the calluses and the cracks, the evidence of a life lived hard and alone. "What do you want to do now?" Eleanor asked, because she had learned that sometimes the most important question was the simplest one. David looked at the garden, at the flowers that were beginning to bloom, at the vegetables that were starting to grow. He looked at the motel, which was still shabby and faded, but which had become a home. He looked at his mother, who was older and grayer and different from the woman he had known. "I want to stay," he said, "for a while, if that's okay." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. She did not let herself hope too much, because she knew that staying was not the same as healing, and that David had a long way to go. "There's a room at the end," she said, "number 6. It needs some work, but it's clean." David nodded, and he smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen on his face in years. The weeks that followed were strange and beautiful and hard. David moved into room number 6, and he began to help with the work around the motel. He was not handy, not like his father had been, but he was willing, and that was enough. He painted the trim on the windows, and he fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, and he mowed the lawn with an old push mower that Clara had found at a garage sale. Eleanor watched him from the garden, where she was weeding the flower beds, and she thought about how strange it was to have her son back in her life. She also thought about how natural it felt, as if the years apart had been a long detour, and now they were back on the same road. Clara and David circled each other at first like two animals who had shared a territory once but had forgotten how to be together. They were polite and careful, and they did not talk about the past, but slowly they began to find their rhythm. They argued about the best way to prune the roses, and they agreed that the coffee at the diner was terrible, and they discovered that they both remembered the same childhood vacations, the same holidays, the same small moments that had shaped them. Eleanor felt her heart expand, filling with a warmth she had thought was gone forever. She also knew that this was fragile, and that it could break. It was Clara who found the letters. She was cleaning out the closet in the office, a small room that had been used for storage for years. There were boxes of old receipts, and broken furniture, and a filing cabinet that was rusted shut, but there was also a cardboard box that was taped shut, with Eleanor written on the side in marker. Clara carried the box to the garden, where Eleanor was sitting in the rocking chair reading a book. Eleanor did not recognize the handwriting on the box, and she did not know what was inside. "It was in the closet," Clara said. "I think it's been there for a long time." Eleanor opened the box, and inside she found letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her, all with the return address of a post office box in a town she had never heard of. The name on the letters was one she knew. Arthur. Eleanor's hands began to shake, and she did not know if she wanted to open them or burn them. She opened the first one, dated 10 years ago, and she began to read. "My dearest Eleanor, I know you will never read this, but I need to write it anyway. I need to tell you that I am sorry for the way things ended between us. I need to tell you that I loved you, and that I still love you, and that I have never stopped loving you. But I also need to tell you the truth. I was not the man you thought I was." Eleanor stopped reading, and she looked up at Clara, who was watching her with wide eyes. She did not stop for long, because she needed to know what Arthur had written. She read through the afternoon and into the evening, and when the sun went down, Clara brought her a lamp and a cup of tea. Eleanor read every letter, and by the time she was done, she knew the truth about her husband. Arthur had had a daughter he had never told Eleanor about, a daughter from relationship before they met, a woman he had loved and lost, a child he had given up for adoption because he was young and scared and alone. He had spent his whole life searching for her, writing letters that were never answered, making phone calls that led nowhere. He had never stopped hoping. Eleanor put the letters down, and she looked at her hands, which were old and wrinkled and covered in dirt from the garden. She did not feel angry. She felt something else, something she could not name. "He was looking for her," Eleanor said, and her voice was barely a whisper. All those years, he was looking for his daughter. Clara sat down beside her, and she took Eleanor's hand. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in her bed in room number 1, and she stared at the ceiling, which was cracked and stained and in need of repair. She thought about Arthur, and the life they had shared, and the secrets he had carried. She thought about the daughter he had never found, and the son he had left behind, and the woman he had married, who had never known the full truth of his heart. She got up and she walked to the garden, and she sat in the rocking chair, and she looked at the stars. The stars did not have any answers. They only had light and distance, and the quiet patience of things that had been there forever. She heard footsteps behind her, and she knew it was David. "I couldn't sleep either," he said. Eleanor nodded, and David sat down on the ground beside her, his back against the chair, his legs stretched out in front of him. They did not talk for a long time. "I found something," Eleanor said finally. "Your father's letters." David looked up at her, and she could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of another secret, another wound. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. "He had a daughter," Eleanor said. "Before me. He gave her up for adoption. He spent his whole life looking for her." David was quiet for a long time, and Eleanor could feel him processing, absorbing, trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle of his father. When he spoke, his voice was not angry. It was sad. "I didn't know," he said. "I thought I knew everything about him. But I didn't know anything." Eleanor reached down and put her hand on his shoulder, and she felt the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of him. She also felt the weight of a new question, a question that had been forming in her mind since she read the last letter. What if she could find her? The next morning, Eleanor called the post office box in the town she had never heard of. The phone rang for a long time, and she was about to hang up, when a voice answered. It was a woman's voice, old and tired, and it said, "Hello?" Eleanor introduced herself, and she explained who she was, and she asked if anyone had ever received the letters that Arthur had sent. The woman was silent for a long time. "I remember those letters," the woman said. "They came every month for years. I was the postmaster here. I didn't know what to do with them, so I kept them. They're still here in a box in my closet." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, and she asked the question she was afraid to ask. "Do you know her? The woman he was looking for?" The woman was silent again, and Eleanor could hear the weight of years in that silence. "I am her," the woman said. "I'm his daughter." Eleanor dropped the phone. She stared at it, lying on the floor, the voice still coming out of the receiver, tinny and distant. She picked it up again, and she pressed it to her ear, and she said, "I don't understand." The woman on the other end began to explain. Her name was Margaret. She was 72 years old, a retired schoolteacher, living alone in a small house in a small town. She had been given up for adoption in 1948, and she had grown up knowing nothing about her birth parents. But when she was 40, she had started receiving letters from a man, Arthur, letters that she had never answered. She had kept them, all of them. She had read them and reread them, and she had never known what to say. "I was afraid," Margaret said. "I was afraid of what it would mean to have a father. I was afraid of the life I might have missed. I was afraid of the woman he was married to, and the son he had raised, and the family I had never been part of." Eleanor felt a surge of something, not anger, not pity, but a kind of recognition. She understood fear. She understood the way it could keep you from the things you needed most. She also understood that Arthur had died without ever knowing if his daughter had received his letters. "He never stopped looking for you," Eleanor said. "He never stopped hoping." Margaret began to cry, and Eleanor could hear the years of grief and longing in those tears. "I know," Margaret said. "I know." They talked for hours. Eleanor told Margaret about Arthur, about the man he had been, the father he had been to David, the husband he had been to her. She told her about the garden he had loved, and the way he had hummed while he worked, and the way he had held her hand in the hospital when she was scared. Margaret told Eleanor about her life, the children she had raised, the husband she had buried, the quiet, ordinary life she had lived. They both knew that there was a hole in that story, a place where Arthur should have been. "I want to meet you," Margaret said finally, "if that's okay." Eleanor looked out the window at the garden, at the motel, at the world she had built in this strange, lonely place. She did not hesitate. "Come," she said. "Come home." Margaret came on a Thursday. She drove a blue sedan that was older than Clara's Honda, and she parked in the gravel lot, and she got out slowly, using a cane that Eleanor had not expected. She was a small woman, with white hair and kind eyes, and when she saw Eleanor standing on the porch, she smiled. Eleanor walked toward her, and she did not know what to say. Margaret